just an RPC for the health change instead of a sync var, and it would explicitly do it. But we actually can still respond to changes on a sync var. And we can do that by saying that this sync var is actually going to have a function hooked into it. So, and I never get the syntax quite right, so I'm just double checking that I've got a window open for the hook, and I actually don't, so that's awesome. Sync var hook, because I just always sort of goof the, there we go. Don't always get the syntax exactly right with the commas, or the parentheses. So, you do sync var, parentheses, hook equals, and then you put in a function name. I don't think it has to be a function name. I think it could be just a name. Let's say we make a function here. This is just going to be a generic function. On player name changed. String new name. There you go. Debug.log. On player name changed plus new name. New name. Thank you. Like that. So we're going to put in a hook here that says when the player name changes, call this function. Now let me check to see if that works as is. Yeah, it does have to be a string. Okay. Oh, could be delegate things. It's predefined. Okay. But for now, we can just have the hook be like that. That's why I keep getting confused, because you can do things with delegates. But there we go. So we put in the name of a function to call when something happens. So on player name change, I'm actually going to go and add a little bit more in here. Old name is going to be, and then new name is going to be. So player name, like this. Okay. So when the player name is changed, we will get this debug log in here. And then we could do something else. We could be something like, oh, how about game object dot name? We want to rename our game object to player connection object square brackets, and in the square brackets we want to put in the player name. Well, the new name. like this. Okay, let's give that a run. Now, I believe there is something slightly like this. Okay, let's give that a run. Now, I believe there is something slightly wrong with this. We'll see if what happens. I don't think it'll be obvious if we're the host. So we're going to hit host, and I'm going to hit Q. So remember, we are both the client and the server. So the client says the message, hey, I want to change my name to Quill68. The server receives the message that says, oh, someone wanted to change it to Quill68. I'm just setting player name equals Quill68. Oh, it is going to do it that way. That's very neat. Okay. So then on player name changes, we see our old name was anonymous and our new name is Quill68. The player connection object gets removed. So that when the player name, I think it could be just a name. Let's say we make a see if that works as is. Yeah, it does have to be a string. Okay. Oh, could be delegate things. It's pre 8. I'm just setting player name equals Quill68. Oh, it is going to do it that way. That's very neat. Okay. So then on player name changes, we see our old name was anonymous and our new name is Quill68. The player connection object gets renamed to Quill68, and the player name field is Quill68 here. However, I believe, I might be lying to you, but I believe that this does not quite work right if we are not the server. Let me check. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't quite work right. But we'll see. It just depends on whether the values update after the hook or not. So we have the server running in the standalone window. I'm going to connect it as a client. I'm going to hit Q over here. Oop. There you go. So I sent a server request to change our name to Quill72. And we received the on-player name change hook triggered, old name anonymous, new name Quill72. And if we look, perfect. If we look here, the name of our object is now player connection object Quill72. But if we look in the inspector, notice our player name still says anonymous. Okay, and this is something that is not super clear in the documentation. But if you use a hook, warning, if you use a hook on a sync var, then our local value does not get automatically updated. Does not get automatically updated. Now, when we were both the client and the server, when we were in host mode, our local value did get updated because, remember, we're running this code over here. This code over here called the hook first, but it's still executed on its own. So on the server, which was also the client in that example, the player name did get updated to Quill68 or whatever it was. But on the client over here in on-player name change, it doesn't auto-update, which means if we aren't the server, we have to go and explicitly set player name equal to new name. Okay, maybe we should put the warning inside of here. Now, I'm not 100% sure, but it's possible that this could create an infinite loop if we are both the server and the client. Because think about it, and I'm not sure, we're going to test it in a second. If I actually am the server, is this going to spawn an infinite series of sync vars? Just in a loop that just keeps saying, oh, I've changed the player name, oh, I've changed the player name, oh, I've changed the player name. Let's give it a test and see what happens. I can close this, and over here we can disconnect. So let's see what happens if we're both the client and the host and we change the name and see if it makes an infinite loop. Oh, it doesn't. That's interesting. But it does correctly update everything. So what I'm assuming then is that while you're in a hook, it must disable the sync var behavior. Or it checks for some sort of duplication. What happens if I set this to like blah, 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 blah. What happens then? I'm just very curious to see if we were breaking this or not. So it either disables the sync var. Huh. Now if we check, and it still sets this afterwards because we're on a server. I think if we were on a client, our player name value would now be blah, 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 blah. Okay. So we have to explicitly accept this. And this is important because we may, for some reason, we may not want to update this on a client. We may not want to update this value with exactly what we got from the server. Now, most of the time you probably will, but if we're talking about position changes, right? And again, I'm pretty sure when you're talking about the built-in network transform script, it's working basically like this, or with an RPC. But our local client that is in charge of this object, when it gets the message from the server about our new position, I don't think it listens to the server directly. Instead, it's sort of like mismatching things. Even if it's not our local client, the network transform might not immediately update the position of the object with the instructions for the server. Instead, it might do a lerp from one position to another to make it look smoother and different things like that. In fact, it does try to keep a smooth looking change in position here. So it's important to be able to have the option to override this behavior. But yeah, if you have a hook that's tied in, over here to our sync var, if you're using a hook, then by default, it won't update your local variable. You're going to have to do it explicitly. This doesn't really apply on the server because you're doing it anyway and yada, yada, yada. But there you go. So those are a couple of different ways that you can send information from the server to the client. And quite frequently, the information that you're sending from the server to the client was actually initiated by yet another client. You can do it with an RPC and you can do it with a sync var. Now, in terms of actual amount of code, if you are using a hook on a sync var, then that's probably exactly the same as an RPC. Because think about it, what's going on here, right, is basically exactly the same as if this were just an RPC. It's like basically the same thing. In fact, I suspect that internally, it literally is the same thing. That the sync var is just calling an RPC, and that's all there is to it. And so when you put a hook, you're basically just writing that. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I don't know if there's a way to get past here. I think that on a hook, you can't say find out who initiated this change. Whereas if you had an RPC, you could actually like pass a reference to the person who initiated this RPC call if it didn't come directly from the server, in case that matters for some reason. But there's other ways to just bundle this information in there. So anyway, lots of talking for not a lot of code, but again, the tutorial that Unity provides for the multiplayer is very fast, but doesn't go into some of the nitty-gritty as to some of the side effects of sync vars and RPCs, as well as some of the different uses for it. And again, remember, the neat thing is there's no reason that you have to use a network transform script. Even if you're talking about controlling your player in a first-person shooter or something like that, or any object that's moving in your Unity space, you don't have to use a network transform. You could communicate the change in movement via your own RPC call because maybe your movement works a little bit differently. What if you're playing a board game? If your game is a board game, you don't have to sync the network transforms at all. Instead, maybe it's just like, you just say, you're moving the knight to e4. or whatever. I don't do chess notation. So literally you can just move objects by passing the string, that is the E4 or whatever the coordinates on the chessboard is. And then each client is responsible for animating the move based on that user's own personal preference. Right? Maybe one user likes the moves to be like fully animated, like a nice slow slide from one location to another. But someone else just wants the units to instantly teleport from point A to point B. In which case, you don't want to use the built-in network transform to synchronize the motion in exactly the same way for anyone. All you want to do is send each client and say, this piece that was here is now over here. You deal with it however you want. And I mean, that could include sending just a vector, right? Your RPC could involve sending a vector 3 with the new position. You could, again, still deal with the animation any way you want, but it could be handled in a million different ways as well. So being able to overwrite those behaviors through clever use of RPCs and syncvars is great. I partially don't like the magic of syncvars, especially with the hook and this sort of like weird timing where like, oh, you can sort of get screwed a little bit. Syncvars are convenient, but I like the explicitness of RPCs. This is, hey, this thing explicitly happened. Now you got to do something with it, which might include updating your local variable. So, like, I like this version of it because it's so much more like super clear and there are no side effects. But for simple syncing of values where maybe you don't even need hooks, a syncvar is pretty convenient. Not gonna lie. Thanks for watching. See you next time, folks. Bye bye. Hey folks, Quillyteen here, and welcome to another episode of our Unity multiplayer tutorial. Now, at this point, we've covered actually all the core mechanics that you need to do your multiplayer game. You know how to sort of register an object to exist on the network. That is to say, you make sure that it's a prefab with a network identity component, and you make sure that after the server instantiates it, the server calls network server.spawn on that object. You know how to send information from a client to the server by running a command, and you know how to send information from the server to a client by running an RPC. There's also what I call a special case of an RPC, which is the syncvar. Everything a syncvar does, you could implement yourself with an RPC, but it saves you a little bit of typing and is kind of convenient. That's all you need to make a game. Everything else is just, well, what kind of game am I making and exactly how do I use that? Now, in this tutorial, we're not actually making a game by itself, although maybe we could make a game as a future tutorial. If you guys have specific suggestions for what you think might make for a nice, compact multiplayer project that shows off stuff, leave comments down below with suggestions for a game. Maybe it's like, well, let's make a multiplayer version of Pac-Man, or, one of these old classic games. There's, that's something to consider. Anyway, but there's a few concepts that are still definitely worth discussing in the sort of general abstract here, and maybe like go through a few use cases of like, well, how might you do X, Y, and Z for a particular type of game. So I have a lovely graphic over here for one of the core concepts that I think if you kind of use this as kind of a mantra, it leads you to other things that become good, just sort of good general ideas for really any game, but especially when you're multiplayering. And that's the general idea of trying to minimize the amount of network updates. Now, the most obvious problem with being too spammy with how much you send over the network, like running too many commands or running too many RPCs, is you might literally run out of bandwidth, right? Bandwidth is basically the amount of traffic you just jam into your internet pipe. And it can actually, start to fall behind if for some reason